And then I will just dive right in. So thank you, Cliff, for joining us. This is Tio with the Arcane Bear. We've got a wonderful episode for you today. Cliff High has been one of my favorite people to listen to and enjoy. I've listened to the Alta reports and the Bare Naked Wealth reports over and over again to try and take in how much information there is. And I know it's not perfect, because I myself agree with your operating assumption that we're all psychic and kind of leaking out the fringe ideas that are happening here. So thank you for taking your time out of the busy day. I just read your Alta report last night, and welcome to the show, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you much. No problem.
So I thought about it and I pondered, and I figured I was going through the questions of what we could ask and how I would organize them. And the first thing I came up with is I should probably ask Cliff what he's excited about and what you've come across in your data recently that's really been piping your emotional levels.
That's got to be the big shift that's coming in my data sets. It shows from February 20th, something like that, very last week in February of next year. And it does not end in the way in which model space has moved. So it moves all the way through short-term data, and it moves all the way through long-term data, including the error range of long-term data, out into the 2020s somewhere. And this big shift, we're in a pre-temporal echo of it now and have been this summer. And that is all of the breakout of the entrepreneurial spirit expressing itself in cryptocurrencies, creation of new tokens, new ideas, etc. So next year, it really happens. Okay, nice. I mean, in like a programming parlance, when you click on a button, there's multiple moves, right? You hover over the button, you click on the button, you push it in, there's the release back out, then there's the release hover. So there's at least four movements in each button click, so to speak. And relative to how our data is showing it, we've just this summer had the hover over. We're about to push the button down. And so next year, in February or so, and there's some level of error. It's not going to be exactly on the 20th or anything like that, but we'll see this shift start in them in visible way as cryptocurrencies start replacing a lot of the functionality that's being absorbed or being still continued on by the old system. And so our problem is that if the old system were to just keel over, there is no replacement for it without a software-based cryptocurrency kind of a system. We can't do it on gold and silver. We can't be mailing little bits of rocks back and forth to each other to try and do our business, right? It just isn't going to happen. We had a big issue, which is the pollution of trust. And banks had always been the stalwarts within that system because they were legislated to be points of trust, at least in the United States. And we sort of set the model for that. And once that legislative authority was stripped back and banks started being usurious and taking advantage of this, they broke all the trust boundaries. And so we needed to replace that. We didn't really need to replace fiat currency, even though we've used up all of the purchasing power of it. But we needed to replace the fact that we couldn't trust the banks because we know they're ripping us off continuously all the time with little algorithms. We've all experienced it, everything from bogus overcharges because your payment didn't get in on time, but you swear it did, all the way to fake accounts trying to pump up the bank itself. And so we see this happening on a global basis where these banks are slavers, they're into human trafficking, they're undocumented pharmacists in that they're moving vast quantities of heroin and cocaine around the planet and financing for it. And so our ability to trust with these people is gone. And it will die pretty much 100% in the sense of most of the populace will click into this, that the banks are really evil things by this time by the spring of next year. And along the process of getting there, as the corruption and everything is coming out, in my data sets, we have this marvelous upwelling, this bubbling, this champagne kind of an effect for entrepreneurs that is going to be really roiling starting in October of this year, and then pop the cork in late February and just keep gushing out for some time. And so it's a truly marvelous time to be alive if you understand the forces that are going on around us. And so the forces to understand is that the bankers know the system is dying. They know it must die for a lot of different reasons. They're assisting that death. They're trying to loot as much as they can as it does die, because many of these people are sociopathic and are self-acquisitive. They want to get everything for themselves. But in the process of this, they also realize that for their own safety, they've got to have something. I mean, they're finally starting to realize that we've got to have something that allows the common person who's not involved in all of that to be able to survive. I personally think a lot of the promotion of the cryptocurrencies has been done by big aspects of the deep state globally to get us to this point. Every time there was a move, other than in one instance in Russia, every time there was a move to put in legislative authority that would cripple and stop cryptocurrencies in particular regions, those moves were shut down, and they made headlines and then they disappeared. The energy just was drained right out of them one way or another. And I did not see that as being quite organic. And so I think there was some hand behind it, somebody who would go to these little legislators and say, probably don't want to do that. And they do it in such a way that these guys would pay attention, and we have no laws restricting or even really regulating. We do have now the threat of regulation coming in the United States from the SEC, but this is more dynamic threats to cause an action than it is, in my opinion, a threat of imminent action itself. So in other words, they're saying, the SEC is saying, be very careful in how you construct your ERC-20 tokens such that they have instant utility and thus pass this particular test and therefore are not a security. Because if you don't, then they are a security, and we've got to come and crawl up your butt with proctoscopes to make sure you're doing everything kosher. And I don't think they want to do that, really. And so I think the way in which they expressed it, the linguistics, the threat was to attempt to cause an action now, and they reinforced that twice, and it's been somewhat successful. So that you now have a lot of people who are paying attention and who have redone some of their stuff so that they're not creating securities that would require regulation, and thus makes it easier on SEC. The cryptocurrency people skate having that level of regulation by, in essence, being self-regulating. Yeah. So it's kind of a cool time. But next year, man, it's going to be just incredible. The reason that it is because all of the money that's in the banking system now, all the stolen wealth, has to go somewhere to be safe. It can't be safe in fiat debt-based currencies. It recognizes this, and the powers that be have chosen the software world of cryptocurrencies to be the repository. So really starting next year is when all that wealth starts funneling in like mad into cryptos.
Well, that's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, I think somewhere along the way they realized that if everyone just went down the drain, that's where most of the power lies in anyways, is us being a part of the system. So if you were to remove that and have a big financial collapse and send everything into total chaos, what power do you have? Power is reliant upon the people that work in every industry that there is, I guess, in the fields, make sure there's food and the delivery of all those goods as well. And without that, the power structure doesn't exist. So they needed to find a way to transition into it, I guess.
Yeah, these individuals are not, most of them are not all that stupid, okay? And you have to understand the perspective of someone who lives behind a wall of security. So we're talking really big money, all right? And when you live behind a wall of security and you're responsible for it, that is to say, it's the security that you pay for, you're acutely aware that your life may depend on how well paid and how happy your employees are, that the health and wealth of your security staff is in direct influence on your longevity, because for all the reasons, exactly. And so the thing is, as I say, these individuals are not stupid. They know they depend on the greater mass of humanity to enjoy their particular status and privilege and position, and they're also bound the same way we are to the system under which we all operate. And so I think that's got them really spooked. That has started to move the leaders of or the former leaders of the herd. There's a real problem for them, though. In crossing into this new world of software, they suddenly become much more vulnerable to becoming powerless. Not ultimately powerless in the sense of being killed by rampaging mobs who don't have anything to eat, but powerless, power degrading from them over time as it diffuses out into the masses. We had a situation here in the United States that existed from, let's say, the 1950s in through the 60s, in which the actual real notional and nominal wealth of the average working person was raising. And it was raising in direct proportion to the rate of growth of money within the money supply, within the system. So basically, a worker in the United States in the 50s and the 60s had a direct percentage, had skin in the game relative to the amount of money velocity through the M3, as measured by the M2 and the M3. And so their lifespan went, or their lifestyle went up in the 50s and 60s, and at the same proportion as did the money supply and the velocity and basically the health of government. Now, it is true that during that period of time in the 50s and 60s, the 1% got poorer because the much more money was being transferred into the larger mass of the population. The populace was happy. We were less prone to all kinds of craziness, and the situation was, but unfortunately, not to the liking of that 1/10 of 1%, because their percentage was shrinking. As Nixon took us off of the more solid standard that we had enjoyed in terms of the gold and silver currencies that we had throughout that period of time, then we got into this tumble loose world of printed, and it has utility and value right away in terms of dollars and so on. And so people that were close to the fountain where these things were printed could become instantly corrupt and make anybody they had touched become corrupt, because it was just a matter of saying back to the Fed, hey, can you print me up another 100 million? And, they do so, right? No one would know. All this stuff was rampant. And so the money supply increased at an astronomical rate, but the wealth and health of the population in general started to degrade. And so we come into the harsh times of the 70s, 80s, 90s. There was the sort of boom period after Reagan when a certain percentage of that wealth went back into the populace. But in the main, since Nixon took us off that gold standard in 72 by closing the external gold window to redemption of U.S. dollars in the United States, from that point on, the health and welfare of the average person is really degraded. And we see that a larger percentage of the population falls into disrepair. Becoming homeless, mentally ill, etc. So all of the ills of society have raised ever since we got off of sound money. So here's the real crux of the matter. We are forced by the nature of the world to go back to a sound money. We're being forced there by the fact that everybody's abandoning the petrodollar. Well, everybody, I mean these countries. China and all these other people are now 100% abandoning the petrodollar, and so it'll just be us and Saudi Arabia that'll be using it, that sort of thing, right? And so under the circumstances, the degradation of the purchasing power of the dollar becomes even more acute. All of our ills become more acute. And so as a result of which, even those people that are very top of our society within the United States, they are trapped also in this paradigm, and they want to get out because they know that over time, the dollar is not a store of wealth, and that the length of that time that it becomes very shocking for them is also shrinking. So 2 years from now, the amount of wealth they might have, 100 million right now, might actually be real money. And in 2 years, 100 million might not be real money. And so they want to preserve their own wealth. They can only buy so much land and so on, and even so, they run into a problem. Land only has value. It's usually the ultimate store of wealth is the ability to produce food on land and have the excess calories, or to produce minerals out of the land or something off of the property. So all of our language takes all of money all the way back, no matter what language you're in, and it always comes back to the ability to own and control property in the form of arable land. And so if we look at the roots of all of this, the ability to store wealth in land, precious metals, fine art or fine wine or fine cars, all of that is degrading. You just can't, there's so much debt-based creation of currency that the ability to shove wealth into those things and a proportionate ability to get it out back later has disappeared. Thus, we're seeing the crashing in the prices for luxury cars and fine art and wine, and even gold and silver had been crashed down, and even now property prices are fluctuating like mad against this backdrop. And so the thing that saves the system and saves all of us as an ancillary aspect of that, a side effect, but also a key aspect, is the cryptocurrencies, because we can build up a system that is functioning while the other fiat system is dying. So our data sets show next year we're going to run into a situation where some fiat currencies will die. Maybe Venezuela, maybe Italy, in the sense that Italy may be forced to abandon the euro and go onto their own systems, these kind of things. So as the fiats die, the things that will make it survive in those areas are going to be cryptos. And then one last aspect of that is, imagine how you could have done if you were a Greek who bought cryptos at the Cyprus crises.
Yeah, back when Bitcoin was around $90, I think, and somewhere in 2011 or 12 there. I actually bought my first Bitcoin at $90, but I was young. I was somewhat of a libertarian. I didn't really realize that the power of the technology was there. I'm not a coder, so the only thing I could see in its value was that it wasn't under government trust. I obviously wish I had bought a significant amount more. But nonetheless, today I'm very, very excited, as you're saying, to see what's happening right now, even in the business world. I think we see some corporate negligence, people that are raising hundreds of millions of dollars in these new ICOs for companies that really have no structure, no long-term plan, etc. Which, I mean, it's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing for capitalism, because capitalism deserves to have a new face represented instead of all the people that are just out for personal greed, etc. Because I really truly believe capitalism is what's incentivizes the economic growth of the individual, to push things like education forward and to keep everyone healthier and happier. Because if that's the case, generally, the whole economic vehicle and vessel should function more efficiently for everyone.
It's self-correcting to a certain extent, though, because as you point out, a lot of these companies have no structure and everything. So we will see some really spectacular crashes, and then everybody in the ICO world that was part of it will say, "Ow, I got burned." And then the next time they're really going to look at that one before they put something into it, right? And so it's a learning process. Part of it is fueled by the fact that always just before you go into a depression, there's huge levels of malinvestment because there's a flood of debt that's trying to go somewhere. And so you just shove it into any corner you can get into. You don't care much, right? And truly, I see these guys on the YouTube saying, "I'm going to give you 9 cryptos. 8 of them are just pigs. They're just pigs. But that 9th one, which we don't know which one it is going to really cover all the other 8 and make you a fortune."
Yeah, I've seen a few of those as well. It's interesting to see, because a lot of the crypto community from the early days are people that haven't managed business before necessarily.
Yeah.
Some of them still look like they may be in their parents' basement. They have no international experience through travel or for just life experience in general. So I think a lot of people have shied away from the crypto world specifically because the majority of the people that are in it right now don't resonate well with the other aspects of life that are trying to look for those stores of wealth. The people that are interested in living healthily with open minds and open hearts, the people that already are living rich lives without driving themselves towards the focus of money. And I start to see more of those people call me up and ask me questions and be like, "Okay, explain this to us." It's one of the reasons why I started the Arcane Bear, is to be a friendlier face and a more notable mind. That's like, it's pretty obvious I'm not out to buy Lamborghinis. I really like my fresh food and water that I grow here in the jungle, and I think people respect that. So it's
right.
Nice
Well,
to see
besides
the
which, you're a Lamborghini in the jungle. All those weeds.
Exactly. The whole front of the car would be covered in bugs and grass, just
Right.
ripping things off. Definitely not practical in the jungle, that's for sure. So I get most of the viewers that are going to watch this later definitely already know who you are and have a great deal of respect for you. A lot of the people that I work with at the Bear Council, they're part of the family of the Arcane Bear. We all have great things to say about you. But one of the questions I wanted to ask that maybe jumps us back a little bit into time is what led you to create? I know you had said it was you were trying to do some stock market stuff, but what was your mindset behind creating predictive linguistics? What kind of brought you to to this idea? Because it's it's a beautiful business model in my in my opinion.
A couple of things basically all came together at the appropriate time. I was doing a lot of consulting work. I had done some really large consulting things for Microsoft where they had some very interesting data early data mining problems to solve, where they had giant databases that would have to create 400 and 500 temporary files in order to seek for a resolution, temporary tables in order to seek for a resolution through the standard understanding of SQL 1.0 standard. And it was because people were using joins, conjunctions, and unions basically on these tables. And each time you had to do it, it would create certain temp tables that would cause you problems later on. Excuse me. Anyway, the issue is the issue for me at the time was I discovered a flaw in SQL, ghosting data. And the only place to write about it at the time, this was in the late 80s, was in the SQL Server Journal that was in Germany, out of Frankfurt, I think. And so I wrote 3 articles for the journal about ghosting data in TempDB. And so I just started thinking about, well, there's got to be a way around some of these issues. And then later on, Microsoft put me on this job that had these huge tables and all these temporary tables and stuff. And I came up, we solved their problem pragmatically, practically over the course of, for Microsoft Consulting Services client to whom I was working. We solved their problem over the course of a few weeks and were able to get them resolved. But the larger problem, Microsoft let me go and think about it for a while. And I came up with this thing called the language model. And so basically what I had to do, because this company had such huge amounts of data at the time, and we were working on 286 and 386 machines, early NT servers, this kind of a deal, that just weren't up to this brute force checking all of these joins and unions. And so I had to come up with some other way of doing it. In the process of that, I had to examine the nature of language and what we stored on computers. Because basically, if we looked at it, some of the most of the data that was being stored in this database, because it was corporate, was repetitious. So it wasn't like Facebook, where everything is different for each person that's on Facebook, and if each person was considered to be an entry into their database with their associated data. It's not like that. All right, most of the data, 99.999% of all the data in this thing was repetitious. It was listings of like this 386 computer 18,000 times, this 286 computer and all of its gear 22,000 times, these monitors 84,000 times, that sort of thing, as each and every department had basically the same kind of equipment. So it dawned on me, well, why are we storing all these words repetitiously when really all we needed to do was to store, if you will, identities of the things we were dealing with. And so this is before object-oriented programming was really taking off. It was available. I'd worked with Prolog, and so I knew how to think in object-oriented programming. It was before JSON file storage or object notation or any of that for databases. But in essence, that's where my mind was leading. In the process of doing that, I had to do a lot of work on language itself, and then started examining and thinking about, couldn't help myself, why do humans choose certain words in certain circumstances? And so I'd be going through the airport, and we just had this 8.1 earthquake in Mexico City. I'm all banged up. I'm leaving that night after doing a gig there at La UNAM, one of the larger universities in the Americas. And so I'm around me, it's everybody reeling from the effects of this earthquake, as we're all sort of, in essence, refugees trying to get home. And I started noticing the conversations around me that night and how the circumstances, as one would think, might inform those conversations. But in fact, it was a struggle. All of the people were trying to continuously return to a more mundane language set. In each and every one of the conversations that I heard on the airplane and in the airport, even back in Dallas-Fort Worth, where I'd landed and was stored overnight because the airplane broke down, even there, we got to a situation where we'd be discussing these fantastic events, and then as soon as we could, we'd all calm back down into our normal language patterns and discuss mundane crap at the house. And so I started thinking, why is there that sort of thing, and it went into how the mind worked, and then predictive linguistics and everything sort of evolved out of it, because it dawned on me those times when we use these words that are outside of our normal lexicon. We're attempting to communicate some level of emotion that we find hard to deal with in some way or whatever. And then I knew that that I had felt prescient aspects of that earthquake before it occurred. And it had to do with my being aware of things. Never in my life had I been in an airplane when I was an adult, had the window open, and was able to see the lightning strikes hit the airplane. And we had half a dozen strikes as we were landing in Mexico City. As we were landing in Mexico City, there was a very bizarre reddish haze that I could not attribute to lighting in this one particular area that's down from that major volcano towards the city itself. And so there were all these things that I was all excited, first time I'd ever been there, and it was late at night, and I was tired. You know, surprising journey from Olympia, Washington, down to Mexico City. It was tiring. I had all this business stuff, so I wasn't really paying attention, but my mind clued into all of these weird things that shouldn't have been there. And then the next morning, sure enough, we get hit by this 8.1 earthquake, and, you know, Volkswagens are bouncing down the road like basketballs, and propane tanks are falling off the tops of 4-story buildings and exploding in the street, and all of this sort of thing. Wow. And so, you know, how much of the stuff I picked up on, I didn't have it in my head to think, oh, earthquake coming, you know. I mean, that kind of stuff never dawned on me. But nonetheless, so I knew that from the language that it was more than a regular level of excitement. And, you know, I was an experienced flyer. I've been flying all my life. When people in my generation, I mean, I used to be an anomaly at a lot of the schools I went to in the South, because I'd actually been in a jet airplane when I was in the primary schools. And at the time I was growing up, that was very rare. So it wasn't like these days. And so, you know, I knew about jet travel, but for some reason there was that emotional excitement. And it was probably, I was feeling whatever kind of, you know, anticipatory waves coming off of the area before it had the earthquake.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's brilliant what you've done. And the operating preface is really a genius idea, because I agree that the superficial parts of the words that we're using are just the top of the wave, but the majority of the momentum of the wave, just like in the ocean, is something that's unseen until it actually starts to crest on the shore, or our more immediate time frames. So what you've done is brilliant, and you can see it from the work, especially in the crypto world, I think, because it's such a small niche, and it's maybe a little bit more difficult to, or it's a little easier to zoom in on, to get that microcosmic view from. You've been doing really great work with it. Your interview with Reggie Middleton was fantastic, and to watch them, I mean, I remember reading about Veritasium before it popped up and exploded, and I was thinking to myself, oh, I don't know how to get into ICOs. I wish I had. I wish I took that extra time to. But I guess that could lead me to the next question. I mean, a lot of people are looking for the next Ethereum or the next Veritasium. Is there anything else in the linguistics for the crypto world coming up that has that type of potential for percentage gains?
Sure, yeah. That's why next year is going to be so fantastic. Really, there will be a couple between now and February in our data sets, and I'll be putting these into the crypto reports that I'll produce the rest of this year. But next year in general is showing, as I say, from the last week in February onward, as being the real breakout, the real crossing of the way we're looking at it in terms of cryptos. It's software eating money, or software technology entering into a new realm. Whenever these things happen, there's a make or break point that's about between 2.5% to 3% of the population becoming involved. Once that happens, then it rapidly scales up to about 10% of the population, and then all hell busts loose. And so we're not at the all hell level. We're about to hit 3% and really race up to that 10%. And so that's why I can confidently say that whatever the hell the price of Bitcoin is at the moment, our data sets are saying 13,800 sometime around the end of February of next year, give or take 3 weeks. and I think we'll be there because we'll rush right up to it. Thereafter, to go from 13,800 to 50,000 is a relatively easily accomplished as we move another 1 or 2% of people into the space, into the crypto space. The thing for the kind of returns you get on Veritasium, this is a very early stage for it, and so it might be thought of as what if you could walk in and you saw, Alexander Graham Bell talking to Watson, and then knew that you could buy into AT&T at a penny a share, right? And it wouldn't have meant anything for probably 20 years. But at the end of that 20 years, you would have been, a significant power on the planet just by having spent a few $100s buying AT&T shares, that sort of thing. And so we're going to see that level all over again. And Veritasium is one that's already out there, the very coin. And so it'll go up a great deal. And it's going to go up because of the people that are already moneyed that need to get their money out and get it into crypto world. And Veritasium is going to provide one of the gateways that will allow fiat to move over into crypto in a easily addressed, easily understood, reasonably tax-friendly kind of way. Because imagine the situation where you were saying, you wish you could have bought the Very, but you didn't know about getting in on the ICOs. It was daunting, the technical issues, and so on. Well, a lot of people with money, they don't even know how to type. I mean, they do everything off of voice commands. And they're lucky that we have, the voice commands, otherwise they'd be dictating to secretaries. So these individuals, to them, the idea of buying in on an ICO is a little bit even more daunting because they're even less technically literate and they depend on a lot of people to accomplish this for them. So Veritasium brings to them a kind of a platform they understand. For them, and the idea of a smart contract makes a lot of sense, and they can see the efficacy of it, and it's a trust component with very little trouble at all. So once there's a couple of connections between Veritasium and their money in other forms, such as stocks or bonds or whatever, then they'll slowly start moving it through, they'll get confidence, and then whoosh. And so Veritasium is going to be, you can think of Veritasium as building fire hoses for the connections that allow money to flow through in vast quantities, where people would be able to buy a contract, for instance, and get exposure to particular assets or risks on stock exchanges and so on at levels that they wouldn't have to work at. In other words, it's difficult to move and do a contract for, say, $5 million of a coin, right? But if you've got that all set up on smart contracts, where you can just put the 5 million into the smart contract, you're dealing with a robot, off it goes, it returns your purchase for you, you don't even have to sweat it, and it's a done deal. Hey, there you go, right? And so they're going to go towards that end, where the rest of us will probably have our little my Ether wallets or something like this, and be sending off our little tokens to do the purchases directly. What Very is going to do is to set up like the robotized kiosks for people with large amounts of money that they need to move into these. For instance, you could write a smart contract. I've already thought about the way to go about it. That would be, I guess you'd have to call it an asset manager, where you would tell the smart contract, I have $500,000 US. Here it is in this bank. You can draw it out through these connections. I want you to put it into these kinds of cryptos under these circumstances, and I want you to come back and tell me how many pennies are left over, and I want you to get as close to spending all of that money as you can in the next 20 days, and or whatever time frame for the ICOs. And these little robotized managers would be perfect for a lot of the people that are simply hedge fund clients with their large amount of money that they made in some other industry.
Wow, so Veritasium still has a lot of leg room to go before it finds a price stability, and not only that.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
And what you and Reggie had clarified really well was the use of it as a generator, more so with winter coming. I actually really appreciated that analogy, that you can put the Veritasium up for rent, much like Populous. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. In fact, I haven't been able to follow it because I've been doing so much trying to clean up my own data mining and the data pollution I ran into. But I've seen a couple of new rent your very Veritasium coin proposals come on out. I don't know if the contracts are written up or not, but I think they're very close if not. And so that would be kind of cool too.
Yeah, seeing it in working order. I think the last time Reggie went live, he had said that they were trying out their Vader, which is the Veritasium research portion of it, etc.
Right.
It's so fascinating to me, and I really like that. The business model is the main front and aim, because there's a lot of people that's like, oh, we're going to create a new technically advanced currency, and we've already covered all of that. It's like we have Bitcoin, we have countless things like Dash or Cloak that will be able to take the transfer layer quite quickly. So seeing people create functional business models in other sectors of finance is greatly appreciated, and I think Reggie's done a great job, and you did a great job interviewing him too. I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you much. I mean, Reggie's a cool guy. I like his thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping we'll give him a shout too and see if he wants to chat with me one day. So here's a kind of an abstract question too. What I'm doing right now with the Arcane Bear was kind of highlighted from something you had written about a year and a half ago. If you look back to the beginning of the arcanebear.com, I wrote a white paper about free media. It was a term that you had talked about as well. And because of what I had read in your work in the Alta reports over a year ago in November, I started doing this. So the question was, do you think that with the linguistics that the Webbot picks up could have effects on the possible outcome of ideas? That basically, because you and I are in a small niche of consciousness and I'm reading the ideas that you're putting out, do they create self-fulfilling prophecies in any way?
There's a lot of, I've been run into it frequently over the years in terms of the thinking about this. And I can actually dispute that, okay? All right. And I can do that on a couple of different levels. Yes, it's possible, but there's a component to it that we have to fold in there. And that is that just because I had an idea and just because you thought it might be a good idea for you to pursue, it does not mean shit if the universe does not want that idea to go forward. Right?
Fair.
I mean, that's true. The universe could make the idea crash no matter who implemented it. And here's the thing, that if universe wants it supported and I write about it, it's not because the idea was one of those that just sort of floated into my head. It was one of those that rose up out of the language, where the looking at the data sets and the layout of the words made that idea in that phrase come into my head. So to a certain extent, it's not internally generated. It's generated by the data sets that go through this processing and present this stuff to me. So to a certain extent, some measurable amount, universe is directly intruding on that. Unless somebody had that thought component A such that we can put it to component B in the software and then go to component C, I don't get the language that then makes me write the phrase that then gives you the idea. So it's not as though it springs whole cloth in my head and I just simply put it on out there. Therefore, I'm of the opinion that yes, it's possible that I can involve myself in that process. And I've actually done some experiments to that effect. So far, the results are less than telling either way. And so, but it is possible for me to do that. And so I would, for instance, be a fool to see the things that indicated Bitcoin arising in early 2005 and not jump on and see that the stuff in 2009 with the Satoshi white paper matched the linguistics I saw in 2005. And then later in 2010, not see that the mining and the software component of that maturing also matched the forecast, and therefore I would have been an idiot to avoid involving myself in Bitcoin, so to speak, right?
Right.
And so I deliberately participated in that, and then I decided, well, in for a penny, in for a Bitcoin. And so I started promoting it and started accepting it on my site and making myself one of the Bitcoin promoting and using community. And so even at little tiny bits, I generate a lot of Bitcoin traffic. I talk about it a lot. And so, yes, I've involved myself in there, but have I in any way contributed to Bitcoin in the sense of a self-fulfilling prophecy? I don't think so.
Right. There's so much momentum already going on there. It's kind of the idea of you might as well ride that wave otherwise you might get rolled out in it anyways.
And there's the rub. If I actually see this stuff in the data and it's valid to me and I write about it, I should have the cojones to say, I'm in for it. I'm there. This makes sense. Let's do it. Otherwise, why bother even writing about it? So right. The point was to actually, within the whole Alta work, was to find stuff that was actionable that could help people in overcoming some of the energetic state in which we're in. And in that sense, I think I've been very successful because I think I actually have been able to contribute to the spread of Bitcoin in an area that the powers that be never, I don't think, would have suspected it coming from, which is the woo-woo community, right? We were in a situation where in the woo-woo community, you've got prophecy people, you've got tarot people, you've got pendulum people, dowsers, you've got all these kind of people that are always psychics, and all these people that are out there telling you and wanting money to tell you what's coming down the road, so to speak, right? And usually the kind of stuff they tell you is not actionable. And so in my situation, I thought, well, look, this Bitcoin stuff is going to be really cool. I'll start telling all these woo-woo people about it. And let's see if they can get it into their head and adopt into it. And here would be a group of people that would have a mindset that was not within the technical mindset nor the money mindset. So in my mental structuring of this way back when, I saw that Wall Street and these people would be moving into software money. And they were going to leave out most of the world, or as much of the world as they can. They wanted to keep the power base for themselves to ride on top of the software money world and so on. And the way that Bitcoin came out, and the people and the processes, including myself, that promoted it, we took that away from them. It's no longer the button-down suit kind of a thing, right? The people that are really the movers and shakers in the world are, libertarians, radicals in all forms, including coders. And so, yeah, you're going to get some really weird business models, and a lot of these companies are going to crap out because you've got people that don't know how to run businesses. But on the other hand, you've also got all their cousins and everybody else making a fortune off of it and participating in this wealth transfer at a level that has never before in history been available to the common individual, except perhaps when Temujin, Genghis Khan, conquered most of the planet. He made lots of people wealthy, because the people that rode with him shared in the loot. But other than that, where has there been a time for the common person to get in on something like this that was really solid?
Yeah, the growth rates are staggering. It's interesting to see people get FOMO in this world too, because if you're sitting on a fundamental idea that you're invested in, like good people, good business, and then good tech lastly, you invest and you are prepared to wait. And normally in the stock market, you'd have to wait years sometimes to get 20 or 30%. And here it's happening so quickly that people are like, I'm in the wrong.
I missed it.
It's really amusing.
Hey, but this is really why my data sets work here, though. Way back when I was writing it I had to have some use for it. I mean, I came up with the idea in the 93 earthquake. All the pieces came together on that airplane ride back home. And then I started thinking about it then. But it wasn't until 97 I had the software sort of constructed, and then I had to have a target. So I decided, well, I'll make some money with it. I can use money. We need to eat. So this was good. And so I decided to aim it at the stock market. And it didn't work. It just all fell on its face. It was flat. And then finally, after a number of years, I realized, well, it's because the stock market is so heavily manipulated that no matter what the emotional impacts are, it won't matter because it's controlled at a level that abrogates and flattens them out or removes them from the equation. Here we're in a situation where there is no manipulation at that level. There's vast quantities of people trying to manipulate cryptocurrencies, for their own evil individual ends all the time, especially on the distributed exchanges where it is possible to do so relatively easily. So you have to be aware of that. But it's not an organized, controlled manipulation the way that we have in the stock market, silver market, and gold market, and the bonds, etc. And so as a result of that, when I see these prescient emotional spikes coming and can peg them to a particular coin, I know we're golden. If that coin is also referenced in the data sets in a matching set of language. So for instance, Populous was easy to see the name because the name shows up in the data sets all the time, right? A lot of the data I get is in the Romance languages. And so Populous shows up. Populous is also the name of a game. But then within there, a major big part of this is what they do, the business model, factoring. And factoring shows up as a giant, I guess you'd have to say, credit machine in the future, the way that it's only marginally a credit machine at the moment. Factoring used to be, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, factoring was the way that most of the businesses survived. And they would go to other businesses frequently, you know, the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, people that had yet to form the banks or were participating in banks at a different level. And they would actually loan money to keep these small subcontractors going. And in essence, then eventually they would, you know, like Ford, they would just fold them in at some point. And so the factoring showed up as just being so huge. So now we get these emotional spikes that are coming out in the language within cryptocurrencies around all different kinds of things. And so what my job then is to go and take that language, sort it out into the categories, if you will, that are going to persist, and then find the ICOs that are going to fill those categories with a best possible fit for the linguistics and a good business model. Does no good to find one that's got great linguistics and no business model at all.
Yeah, no, you've done a spectacular job. I was the last reports, the Peruski. I mean, it's so hard to keep up with all the information, and I'm sure you know this too. Just working full time on something else and trying to inform people about what's going on, you rarely have time to invest in it. But being a part of the movement in general right now, I think, is such an inspirational thing to see, because it means we can react more efficiently, not just in a business sense, but in a global populist sense, to the problems that we're facing, many of which you talked about in the Alta reports, the general disregard or I guess misunderstanding of how we've gotten to the freak weather storms that we're at now, and what the causes are, really. So my next question, I guess, was, do you see the weather problems and patterns becoming part of the financial degrade as well, or is it mostly systematic due to the lockup of liquidity?
No, you can't separate the financial system from the problems of the planet, because you have to bear in mind that we're experiencing crop losses continuously now. We're now the second or third year into a net negative crop situation on the planet. So in 3 years ago, it might have been vanilla beans, coffee, and blackberries. And this year it might be apricots, avocados, and celery. But we're losing crops at a significant level, to the point where sometimes whole crops are lost. And so this has a financial impact. This has an impact not only at the level of those things not being able to be sold by the people that grew them, but also crop insurance, derivatives of all kinds that were based on that, and it pyramids up in these like spouts from whatever that cause was. So the weather is going to really continue to impact, and we're going to have to spend more and more parts of our global GDP reacting to that. So it's sort of a good thing, because it's going to help the debt system degrade. A lot of the malinvestment will go away, and then we'll start getting really smart, if we're to survive, about where we're going to put our resources. And we'll then start forming ventures that will be directed at those resources. And so I think it'll be like disintermediation. So, for instance, Red Cross and a lot of the global charities are going to die off in the next couple of years because they can't be trusted. But there will be a charitable outlet that will arise that will be blockchain-based, that where you will be able to have trust, at least in the organizational level. So instead of here, you think you can trust Red Cross, and so you give your money to Red Cross, and then only now to discover Red Cross says, we have no idea where the hell we're spending it or if it's doing any good. And so you don't feel good about giving your money to Red Cross because, once again, the trust barrier is gone. So what if someone sets up a blockchain-based thing where you buy a coin, and these coins are redeemable by people in disaster areas that can then, every time you buy a coin is handed out to somebody in a disaster area. They can go and redeem that for, ice, milk, water, whatever it is that they need in their circumstances. And here you'd have a one-to-one connection with the people that are receiving your charity, which is better than simply dumping it on the corporation. You don't have to mess with actually handing the money to them or manipulating the system to get the money to them. You can have some level of assurance that the level of fraud would at least be down to the individual level. Okay, so maybe that guy wasn't really in the disaster area and he walked over from the other county. Okay, but you're not going to get hundreds of millions of dollars that go missing because that one guy got an extra free meal when he shouldn't have. Right. So the level of fraud is brought down to the point where it's within the trust boundary of the system. Instead of these people at the head of Red Cross that are flying in private Gulfstream jets that they actually own through proxies that they're renting back to the corporation that is the Red Cross and making money on their own flights to and from to whatever, and it makes it look like it's under the umbrella of the Red Cross, like it's legitimate and it's necessary and urgent. And, so you've got all these kinds of frauds that are going on within the charity system that would go away. When that happens, imagine those hundreds of millions actually getting to relief, right?
Yeah.
And so the world changes at that level just because the blockchain exists and it can take away all of these trust abusers and get rid of them.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most inspiring parts of the business model and the vision that we've been working on here at the Arcane Bear is to find a way to provide the media as well as the platform and voting community to offer those types of things, to be able to vote on causes that we can show up at in the future. Because if there's no one showing up, much like Danny Sessoms of the Crypto Talk Show had done, raised $100,000 in maybe a few hours and then was out in Houston, Texas like that, beating Red Cross to the punch and doing those things, trying to form a business model and structure that makes helping humanity profitable again. Because the NGOs and NPOs have gone down a really interesting path where they're limited to their crowdfunding because somewhere along the way we thought if you spend less money on crowdfunding, you can give more people money to the cause, which is generally kind of antithetical, because the more big companies that can spend a lot of money on advertising, marketing, and crowdfunding bring in a lot more money for those causes. So now that we're getting rid of regulations, things that would say, well, this is what an MPO should be, we can reignite the flames between being a charitable, or maybe not charitable, maybe charitable isn't the right word, but a cause-based media source while still providing a profit to the people that are involved. And once the CEOs of a lot of the MPOs don't get paid enough to that the really intelligent people show up. So we need to raise the barrier that attract the intelligent people to helping support the more problematic areas.
Well, it's like Catherine Austin Fitts said, basically I hear her say it all the time, I'm paraphrasing, that we have no idea how profitable this planet would be, or how wealthy the planet would be if we were to make doing good things profitable.
Yeah.
And right now, the only thing that is profitable is stealing within the debt-based system, because at its core, it's a form of theft, where they print off and they know they're going to steal 2% of your money if they reach their target inflation. They're going to steal 2% of your purchasing power each and every year from the dollars that you hold. Where is this? Wait a second. You're going to give me a 0.5% interest, so you're going to give me a 0.5% back that itself has even lost its purchasing power. So no, So the model there is going to really be great, but it's going to be very interesting times as we devolve from the current structure and are building these things up on the other side. And then we're going to have all different kinds of approaches, because we can do that now, because those barriers to entry are gone. It's reduced so that you could compete with Red Cross and show them up simply because you happen to be at that particular point in your life and in an event to be able to do this. And also, by the way, now we also know that we're in a period of time when traditional advertising is dying, when the trust level is killing Facebook and Google and some of these large outlets, to the point where they may not even exist in a few years because their advertisers don't trust them because of the huge amount of fraud involved in internet advertising now that is actually stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from advertisers. And so the way in which the system evolves over these next few years is going to be quite fascinating, especially to somebody who studies language, which is fundamentally all that advertising is the ability to express yourself to the point where you intrigue someone else's mind to pursue their interest or their attention on your particular focus. Now, when you get into it, you know what's going on, at least with my predictive linguistics, advertising, it's not going to be our grandfather's advertising model anymore. And we'll see that next year in a serious way as all different kinds of things break out.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I was doing yoga the other evening, and I imagined Arcane Bear helicopters flying in to help people. So I figured I was either delusional or onto some pretty good ideas in the future here.
Well, maybe so, but you know, helicopters are maintenance headaches.
So, flying triangles. Well, I'm more than
floating triangles.
Yeah.
Apparently are the route to go. Yeah,
I'm more
anti-gravity.
patient.
You know, let's start using that word again.
Yeah. So here, where's my next question here? So let's quickly touch on you. JSNP had released a video saying that you were. I mean, you can answer this if you'd like to or not, but that OMG was showing a potential to move much higher. Significantly so. And we had been doing some fundamental research on it, and it looks like Apple may even integrate it into all of their phones as a part of a pay service. I
hadn't heard that. I was looking at it linguistically from what's going on along the One Belt, One Road initiative, Beijing to Berlin. There's been a lot of predictive linguistics that have shown up around that particular area when I actually do research on the stuff that's being printed out and written in all of the little stands, Kazakhstan, etc., Uzbekistan, and then even all the way back to Beijing. I find that we're into an OMG kind of a situation for that particular coin. So I can state a number here. It's not out of the data per se, but I have some link because we rarely get numbers that come through. It's all linguistics, right? But I do have a reference to a number in an oblique fashion in terms of a percentage gain for OMG coin. Now, here's the problem. It's a long-term reference, okay? So it's not saying that it'll happen even in the next 19 months, but it may be at this stage between 19 months out and some period after that. Maybe another 36 months after that, the statement I'm making will be true. And the value of, or the truth of the statement that would be measured would be that OMG coin has had a 30K appreciation.
Yeah, wow. That's
staggering.
Staggering percentage.
Now I believe that is relative to percentage, not actual times the value of but who's still a 30,000% increase is still a staggering amount of wealth that's been moved into that. And you know, there's what's really cool is I've got people that read my stuff that are in villages or in Thailand. And so the word gets out to a village in Thailand. They scrape together the wealth of the village, which amounts to basically $5,000 US. Huge. And this is the entire wealth of the village. And they invest based on the stuff that these individuals have read in my reports. And boy, I'm hoping that they're reading my reports for accuracy, you know, because a lot of people don't. But in any event, and so some of these villages have done very well to the point where it's not a single individual whose life has been altered, but the life of the whole village, to the point where we're talking 150 to 200 individuals, and their lives have been fundamentally changed because of what they've done in the cryptocurrencies. And it's been, as you point out, in these last 5 months, they've been able to staggeringly increase their wealth. So one outfit I know of, one small village in the Philippines, had about $3,800. It's like I think it was like 3813. That's how much they bought, and they bought in partial Bitcoin and then some Ethereum, and then they started spreading the Ethereum around in a couple of the initial coin offerings. And so that wealth now has crossed the $50,000 mark. And so for the whole village to be able to scrape that amount together. Who knows how long it took them to get that, and now to have that returned to them at that level. They haven't sold out or anything. I'm sure they sell out now, that's what they would get back. But so they now have their operating budget for their particular village cooperative, so to speak, for a number of years taken care of already. And look at this. These guys are way out in a rural area, and yet they're still involved in cutting edge technology now. So there's no longer a place barrier to being a global player, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
This is cool. I mean, this is just staggering.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think that the village that someone could convince them too. This is the first time.
Well, it was easy. It was easy because of it's very similar to this woman who wrote me from Thailand. She's gotten a couple of other villages that are sending her money to invest because I want to say, yeah, it's her son had taken $6,000 US. He's in a more urban area in Thailand, and he turned it into 68,000 US. And so his wife, bragging to her relatives back in the village, my brilliant husband, blah, blah, blah. Villagers say, hey, we want in on this action. Well, it's really coming from the fellow's mother, not him. And so she's taking charge of it because she says she's a little bit more conservative than he is with other people's money. But, they're going to be able to do all right. And so it's that same kind of thing. It's easy to convince people when you can demonstrate success.
Right. Yeah, my mom and my little brother both purchased some Bitcoin back in April, and they're quite happy that they did now. I'm sure, like everyone else back in April, they'd wish they had bought more. But it's interesting to see, like you're saying, that it's moving out into the rural areas, that the technology isn't really going to be bound to the cities like we're used to, where San Francisco is one of the tech hubs of the world. This is already a global demonstration of software developed money, like you were saying. That's a fantastic story. I really like that. So I had another quick question about the coins before we move on. Is there anything in your data about what was Ant Shares and now Neo?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Neo's really good as well. It's not a competitor for OMG. They're on almost a parallel path, and I see almost as much Neo chatter in the Berlin to Beijing, or however you want to look at it, railway area. And so that's a real good indicator for its use in there. And as Ant Shares, it had a tremendous amount of long-term data. And so they rebranded. I now have to go back in this next set of processing and deal with that shift over from the label Ant Shares to now looking for it under the label Neo. So there's some things I have to do in data mining to stay current. And I haven't gotten to that part of the processing. But the last time that I'd run through on the Neo, I've got long-term legs on the thing going out past 2020, because bear in mind, we're going to run into a situation here that's going to start next year and go for at least the next 2 decades as all of the fiat currencies around the planet die. All of the wealth that's in those fiat currencies has to go somewhere, and so it'll be funneling into all these ICOs, all these weird tokens and stuff. Some of it will just go poof, and that's what we need to have happen because there's been such hyperinflation. We just need to get rid of the stuff. There's just too much money on the planet. And so in this case, the malinvestment serves a useful purpose in educating people not to do such stupid things, and also making some of this phony money disappear. But Ant Shares has got a very unique cultural hook into China that is going to propel Neo out along with this process for those 2 decades. I've got long-term data for the Ant Shares.
Yeah, I had we had been coordinating a kind of a connection between Neo, Quantum, Civic, and OMG as a kind of a cooperative function of financial cable or something as well. So it's interesting that you're finding that in your data too. So now some of my favorite stuff, I know I keep the best for last. I love the woo-woo. I grew up a very esoteric person. I've studied all sorts of Kabbalistic literature to things like the Golden Bow, which is a bunch of traditional shaman stories, etc. So let's get into Antarctica a little bit, because I would love to hear
Sure.
what's coming up in those data sets.
Well, all kinds of crazy stuff. But the really interesting part of it is that by this time next year, that is to say, just entering into fall of 2018, we should be able to have another conversation at that time and discuss the emergent or has been manifested level of historic disclosure or disclosure about our history or disclosure about some aspect of our history. All of these kind of words are in there. Now, I don't have anything saying it's going to be, how man came to have the big toe that he has. I don't have anything that specific, right? I just have very generalistic language at this stage that's in the long-term data sets that's being populated by some short-term and immediacy data as well, which means we're going to get a temporal echo. So we'll get some kind of I think between now and December, there will be a leak or yet more dribbling out of information about human history that may go a long way towards like confirming Michael Cremo's, forbidden archaeology kind of a view that we're millions of years old, that kind of thing. And it's going to be, there's a lot of ancillary data sets that go to the idea that the Vatican gets real upset, sort of. It's as though they're playing they're upset about it, but they knew it was coming, and that they're participating in this generalized information release and that sort of thing. So it appears very coordinated within the data sets, as though there's going to be a front theater to go along with it with appropriate denials, but that they're there to just raise the general level of awareness of the thing, rather than to actually try and get people to disbelieve it. And so it's going to be, I think, very much a case of a lot of the way in which they'll do it. It's like, oh, well, if the Catholic Church is condemning it, then it must be true, because they're so voraciously condemning this particular idea. And so whatever it is, I think we'll find to be very, very interesting relative to the woo-woo world, probably very much confirmatory of a lot of things that we already think. How much further it gets us, or how much closer it gets us to actually seeing pictures and this kind of thing out of there is anybody's guess. On the other hand, there's a lot more data saying that we're going to be back, I don't want to say back, a sort of a surreptitious disclosure is going on right now, that there's stuff that's coming out of the work in Antarctica, and it's already started, and we're going to, if you look around, I guess, the data is suggesting that if we look around, we'll be able to see it in a much clearer manner over these next few months and into next year, as new kinds of technologies really do emerge, and we start having whole industries set up around these new technologies, and they start funneling on out. And it won't be like cell phones or that sort of stuff. The kind of things that is being described is very much like one might think of as the heavy machinery that would allow you to set up the ability to have floaty thing factories that were out in the open, right? Now they've got to basically build those things more or less one-off, hand-built kind of a deal, because they don't have bazillions of subcontractors openly trucking anti-gravity parts back and forth to the main anti-gravity factory place. And we don't have anti-gravity sales lots, where you go and pick up your floaty triangle or sell your used one or trade it in. None of that infrastructure exists. There's a lot in the data sets that are suggesting that an infrastructure that not to that point, not to the anti-gravity specifically, but that an infrastructure is being built out around us, basically, sort of without telling us. There's maybe a grand design, but we're not going to be privy to it. One day we'll just wake up and think, oh, well, geez, that's a odd company over there. What do they do? And then a few days later, you see another odd company opening up down the road doing something else that's really very much on the cutting edge of technology, and you wouldn't have thought possible, this sort of a thing, right? And so we may see, 3D laser chisels that could take a lump of stone and carve you a statue in 5 minutes based on a graphic image or something along those lines. And this would be an example of that infrastructure being built out around us when those 3D printers arrive on our desktop to be able to make little rocks or carve statues to give away as tchotchkes or something.
You had mentioned before that silver would likely become one of the important and precious pieces of the technology that comes out around around energy. Is that likely to be like you're saying, a leak into mainstream, or is it to be? Will it likely be built around us before we notice, and all of a sudden we'll be like, wow, here's all this new technology?
If you wanted to pay attention, you'd be able to see it. I'm quite convinced of that. Okay, but if you're just doing your regular job and you're driving back and forth to work and all this kind of thing, and you go to the beach on the weekend, you're not going to be paying attention and you won't see it. But if you were to go and look at specific kinds of scientific journals for things that are relating to field mechanics, field manipulation of energy, and so on, you'll start seeing it. Maybe even you can see it now. There may be articles out about it now. They won't put it in the language I'm going to use here, but silver is a very unique metal. It's unique, much more so than gold. There's tungsten that has no native unalloyed form on the planet. There's gold that only has its one unalloyed form, which is pure gold. And then there's silver, which has got two forms. And one of those two natural forms of silver is going to turn out to be like psi metal, like psychic. Okay, like in that use. And there's a component of the woo-woo stuff within our data sets that's been going on for a number of years that are saying that people will be working as field manipulators. So instead of being a forklift driver, you would have a handheld device that had a lot of silver in it, and you'd manipulate, but maybe even having part of your consciousness involved, this anti-gravity sled that worked instead of the forklift. But the key component coming through the data sets is not that we get an anti-gravity sled for the forklift, because that's still the forklift kind of a job being done, right? It's not really that much of an improvement other than efficiency and less friction and so on. But what's the really cool part is that we're going to be shifting over to these more use of consciousness within the technology. And so there's a lot of language within the data sets that go to the idea of consciousness within the technology. Not in a negative sense, not in the sense of, your brain being taken out and powering a robot or anything, but rather that there is a component that silver will tap into because of some aspect of its ability within the matrix of reality, its crystalline form, its solid nature. There's some aspect of it that is also radiant. So it's not merely solid. There's a component of it that's also radiant solid or solid radiant. And so thus it's able to react and to respond to other radiant things, such as the radiations that we emanate out as consciousness. And so however they're going to characterize that, we will find language around those kind of ideas coming out. And then within a couple of years, we'll start seeing, maybe anti-gravity forklifts. They're controlled by a silver device they may give you some kind of a nice little interface, but really what they're trying to do is get you to focus your mind on the task. And so if you really got to it, you could just set the device apart and do it with your mind once you learned how to do it. But in the beginning of this new technology, we'll have to take advantage of silver as this bridge, as this, if you will, psychokinetic or psychotronic sort of a bridge to the manipulation of these fields.
Wow, psychotronic, that's a word I have never heard, but very much so enjoy. I like where that could go.
Yeah.
The last interview you did with Sarah Westall, you brought up C60. A friend of mine I spoke with the day afterwards, after that interview, and he brought up that he had been taking shungite. Is that how you say it?
Shungite, yeah.
And that the doctors had told him he may not make it past the age of 18 or 19, and he's effectively now just under 60 or something. So I was blown away to see that this it has, as far as we can tell from his story, he attributes the majority of his ability to make it past where he had to the shungite. So I started looking into it, and anytime I hear Buckminster Fuller's name come up, it's it seems to lead some credibility to the idea. Is there? And I know you're a big fan of Ayurveda and medicines like that. My next question would be, in these new fields of medicine that that you've been pulling data out. What does some of that stuff look like? Because as a musician, as a composer, someone who's gone through ayahuasca ceremonies and stuff, vibration has always been, to me, one of the most important elements of what our next generation of technology might look like for medicine. Is there anything in that data set that you have?
Well, that's the fields. It all comes down to that, see, because that is vibration itself. So let's back up for a second. When you take psychedelics, if you take them at a shamanic level, and which you must if you're going to take ayahuasca, it is not a recreational Friday night kind of a thing, right? Okay, but when you take psychedelics that way, some of the things that happen to you is that your body goes through that dissolution phase, okay, where you're quite sure you're going to die. You know you're in the process of dying, but everything's going on and you don't care so much. Okay, and so you go through this process and then you go into and you contact the other. When you're actually doing that, that's the consciousness that is lessening or reacting to or losing its ability to react to or letting go its ability to react to the material world. Now, matter is not what most people understand it to be. We think we are solid, and that nothing could be further from the truth. As we know, when you take psychedelics, you're actually able to see the void at times and interact with the pulse and all of this. And so if we think of matter in a particular way, we understand matter as energy, and it's really a condensate. Okay, you have in my cosmology, there was a pulse. There was this initial pulse, and it vibrated from point A to B. It shot across instantly. There was no space involved. The pulse moves beyond space and is free of time. And then the pulse got really bored, so it crossed over itself. And then it started crossing over itself infinitely and shooting all around. And the pulse moves at 22 trillion times a second. 22 trillion times a second, this thing is pulsing. And 22 trillion times a second, it stops. And there's a void. It is that gap that allows us to see motion, okay? And I feel and experience motion. Because without that gap, all molecules would bond together and there'd be no motion and consciousness would be trapped. It is that gap that the Zen people and the yogis call the void, the abyss, all these various different terms. That gap is how we actually form matter. So what happens is that as all of those trillions of pulses of energy within this area of no space and no time, as they cross over itself infinitely, at some point that in that infinite progression of layer upon layer upon layer of energy becomes very dense as it crosses over into these nexus. And at some point a molecule is born. And simply because it condenses out of all that energy, the next level up of energy turns it into matter. When matter comes in to existence, it brings not only the molecule, let's say it was hydrogen ion, the very first thing that was created was a negatively formed hydrogen ion. And so when it came into existence, it brought with it space, because space didn't exist prior to that. And it also brought with it a little bit of time, because time didn't exist prior to that. And so then the pulse said, well, hey, this is cool. It created matter. And so then it started bouncing off itself all over the place, and the next thing you know, all kinds of matter is being created. And some of the matter is more dense than hydrogen and becomes oxygen, argon, all these other gases, etc. And then the pulse gets really crazy, starts going into complexity, and the next thing you know, we've got solid matter, we've got carbon, iron, nickel, silver, all of these different metals and materials being created as little bloops as matter pops into existence. So there is no Big Bang. This is the little bloop theory. That reality is continually creating itself, even as we sit here. This is ongoing. There's new matter being created. That's why our universe continually expands. It's because the pulse is continually generating itself instantly. 22 trillion times a second, it creates itself. 22 trillion times at a second, it disappears. And every time it recreates itself, it becomes ever so slightly more complex. And it keeps pushing out the boundaries of our known universe in doing so. Now, we're getting back to the C60. In Shungite, C60 is only at maximally 2%. Shungite is actually the result of the cyanobacteria taking up C60 to protect itself from radiation, because at the time that the cyanobacteria existed, the Earth was very much more radioactive, because as energy creates itself into matter, in the early stages, it's easy to flip over into lots of radioactive material, because basically the complexity has to grow and grow and grow until things start stabilizing. We can get into the math of that at some other point. But so the health and the C60 and the fields are all joined. C60 works in the body. From the shun guide, it's only 2%. So imagine what it would have done for him if he'd been able to take pure form C60 that had been extracted and put into oils, as opposed to putting the shun guide into water. And C60 in Shialajit, which is the Ayurvedic form of the stuff, is only 1.5 to 2%. And so there's that may be that's how universe intends us to take it. But nonetheless, at this stage, we can more effectively take the pure form because we now know what we're dealing with. And it turns out that here we've got C60, and unlike a regular carbon atom that just wants to glom to stuff, C60 is a wrapped in form of carbon atoms that are called buckyballs, and they look like two geodesic domes or a soccer ball. And it turns out, what does that thing do? It vibrates. What does it do? It vibrates at all these resonances, depending on what's around it. And so I've got this one guy who's a researcher who's saying, hey, what it does at this particular level is that when you're exposing it to particular kinds of electromagnetic radiation, it excites the C60 and it runs around and it scoops up hydrogen free radicals. And that electromagnetic radiation can be created, so to speak, by the human body. In other words, C60 is inert until you get it into a particular position, so to speak, to be useful. And so it's just an interesting molecule all along. In our data sets, we've got a lot of stuff about making the jump into what we can think of as vibrational therapy. But the vibrational therapy for human health is very little different from the vibrational tools that we'll develop that will allow us to control the anti-gravity forklift because it's all field manipulation, and we are fields. Our brains are just operating at such a slow rate of speed, we can't see ourselves as the energy we really are, and we can only see the material part of it. Now, on the material part, the C60 is really cool stuff.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And to think of so cymatics is a fairly simple science that shows you that sound isn't just an up and down waveform as we've been taught in school, that it actually contains geometric shape and form. Some of the highway patrol badge officers in the United States where you're from all have a 7-pointed star on their shoulder, but you can actually create that exact same shape when you play an E flat note. And that to me is fundamentally fascinating because it leads to the idea that if you're diseased or you're out of ease, what can bring you back into tune essentially. And as a musician and as a composer, this has always been one of the most fascinating concepts for me, is to see the potential of medicine vastly surpassing how we understand it today, where it's something, you ingest, it's just a physical form, whereas music and vibration can enter the microcosm of a person or the field, as you're saying, and possibly retune someone. So if C60, just to hypothesize, is in any way sympathetic, like you're saying that it starts to resonate as other things around it resonated, much like a sympathetic string on a sitar or something, maybe it becomes even more effective under the use of music, etc. as well, because it's reacting to vibration at a fundamental level.
Yeah, within our data sets, though, I think you might be somewhat not discouraged, but slightly disappointed, because what they're going to do is they're going to take that and they're going to reduce the cymatics or the aspect of it down to the subharmonics, and it'll be ending up being much more computer controlled and much less an oral experience so much as a whole body experience when you go on in to get your field adjusted. So they won't actually play music. You'll just become part of the vibration. Nice. So you'll be bathed in it or become part of that vibration as the process, and it'll settle you all down. Sort of like, if you want to think about it, it would be like a vibrational massage.
Yeah, I think I could go for one of those. That's it. We're waiting for flying triangles and vibrational massages to bring us back into tune.
Exactly. Hey, we're good to go. Yeah.
I'm on for the ride. Thank you so much for your time, Clif. I actually really hope we get to do this again in the future. I've had such a great time chatting with you. You've always been a brilliant mind that I really look forward to. Anytime I see your name come up on YouTube, chatting with Jay Snip or Bix Weir, I devote time to making sure I listen to that, because you're inspiring with the way we look at the future. I know in your Alta reports you said that if some of it's doom and gloom, you can ask for a refund, but knowing that there's there is positive movement coming, and that we're likely part of it, whether we create a self-fulfilling prophecy or not, but we're part of these changes. Has been really inspiring for me, coming from an area where I moved out into the jungle to grow food and have fresh water, because I was like, oh, we're screwed. We're done, guys. We blew it up. We're just going out to live out the last of the days. And now I feel there's the innate part of my spirit recognizes what your data is saying and what you're reflecting, and it's inspired me to move forward with a veracity in a business plan that I'd never seen coming. Like, for instance, if you had told me that I was going to use my music microphones for a podcast 2 years ago, I'd have been like, "What? Doing for what?" Wouldn't have believed you. But I had a great time today, so thank you very much. And
sure,
actually,
glad to do it. Yeah.
After we do this, I'd love to spend just a few more minutes chatting with you on a personal level. Leave all the personal questions out on the other side. So thank you, guys. This is Clif High. For those of you that haven't checked him out, go to halfpasthuman.com. He does his crypto bare naked wealth reports. I believe they're about $100. You can pay with crypto or with PayPal. I have purchased every single one that he's done, and I love the reading. Just for the reading itself, even if you were just making this up, the reading to me is more than valuable enough to pay for. And I know you're not, but I always purchase your reports, even the Alta reports. So I'm sad to see that you won't be continuing with those, but I'm definitely excited to hear that you'll continue with the bare naked reports. You can check Clif High out on his YouTube page, and anything else I should let anyone know about?
That's fine. Yeah, I'm on Twitter too, but you'll find those links if you care.
Perfect. Yeah, well, check him out on Twitter as well. Give this man all the love he deserves, because it's one of my favorite characters. Thank you, Clif.
Sure. Okay. No problem at all.